We're
Sure.
good to do so.
Well, great. Well, I want to introduce one of our newest Tiger Bay Club board members, but certainly not new to the capital city area with his many years of community service through his work with the Chamber of Commerce, Leadership Tallahassee, United Way of Big Bend, and other organizations. And in his spare time, he runs this little PR and communication shop. And we really wish him the best of luck with that side of the business. But I wanted to introduce Ron Sachs, who will introduce our guest speaker this morning. Ron, take it away.
Well, thank you, President Johnson, and thank you, Jay, and especially thank you, U.S. Attorney Larry Keefe, for joining our Tiger Bay Club this morning for this important program. Mr. Keefe's bio was in the email invites that Tiger Bay sent out to all of you, but the highlights is he's a Florida native from Okaloosa County, attended the University of Florida on a football scholarship, also went to law school and spent the bulk of his career as a civil litigator and a pretty accomplished one. His service as U.S. Attorney is almost 2 years into the term appointed by President Trump, and we will talk about that and the change in national government. But first, I'd like you to know that his wife's a terrific pediatrician over in their home area in Shalimar in Okaloosa County. And there are 4 sons. For all of us who have children, you want your children to have a service mentality. If you would, Mr. Keefe, besides greeting everybody, talk a little bit about what your 4 sons do for a living right now, because I think it's quite impressive.
Certainly, Ron. First, thank you, Tiger Bay Club, for having me on. I know about your organization, and I've been a fan of it for years, and it's a great honor to actually be a guest on the show. About my wife, Lynn, and I have 4 sons, the oldest of which is a clerk for a federal judge in North Florida. Second son is in the United States Air Force, in the Air Force's brand of special operations. And number 3 son, we actually do call our sons by number sometime just to keep it straight, 1, 2, and 3. I'm on 3 now. Number 3 son is a special agent in the United States Secret Service. And number 4 son recently graduated from the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, and he is a worker in the private sector.
Wow, what a commitment, though, to public service as defined by your public service. Well, to start out, let's go to the obvious. We all witnessed something a little more than 3 weeks ago that we maybe never thought we would see: an attack on our own nation's capital by Americans. And in the time since then, you and your colleagues in federal, state, and local law enforcement have been not only pursuing people who have participated in that, but actually trying to find people who are intent on violence from either end of the political spectrum. Can you tell us what it was like to be in the job you're in, and what you and your colleagues are doing that you can speak of to bring to justice people who participated in that insurrection?
Well, there's basically 2 sides of that from my standpoint. The people in the Department of Justice, the people in the U.S. Attorney's Office here in the Northern District of Florida, we're human beings and citizens just like anyone else, and that occupies a good part of our brain and who we are. But the other part is the focused professional that is not focused at all on anything other than whether there have been criminal law violations and whether there should be charges and accountability. I think, as many Americans, was appalled about what happened at our Capitol on January 6th. It was a siege. It was an attack on our democracy. And most of the folks that I know felt that way, had those feelings, whether they are in the Department of Justice or in or out of law enforcement. But quickly, the focus became accountability and investigations, and everybody was focused on that. The investigations and the prosecutions are being handled by the U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., but the other U.S. attorneys around the country, of which there are 93, have been very involved with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and our state and local partners on identifying individuals who left the Capitol, returned to their homes, and investigations are ongoing there. We had an arrest last week of an individual in the Pensacola area. And so that's what's going on. We, the other 93 U.S. attorneys, are supporting the U.S. attorney in Washington and, of course, Maine Justice. There's a heightened level of energy, focus, and resources to make certain that there's accountability and there's a strong general deterrent message sent that this sort of behavior won't be tolerated.
Well, thank you. You referenced the arrest out of Pensacola of someone that you all determined had allegedly participated in traveling to Washington to participate in the attack on the Capitol. But before that, you also arrested a local individual here in Tallahassee, maybe from the extreme left end of the political spectrum. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, certainly the situation with the individual who went to Washington, who was involved in the assault and siege on the Capitol, whole different set of circumstances. The individual who is being charged by our office, who you speak of, who was arrested in Tallahassee, had made threats that had exceeded far the free expression, First Amendment rights that we all have to express general views and opinions on things, and it crossed into the arena of imminent threat and harm and violence to individuals. And that arrest was made, and that case is being handled right here by our office.
Well, we all remember 9/11. We all remember the attack on the federal building in Oklahoma City by Timothy McVeigh. The name just comes to mind without having to Google it. But we seem to be in this era of heightened danger within our own borders from our own fellow citizens. And, you know, as the oldest person on the screen right here, I'll tell you, I can't remember feeling like we're in a less secure, more dangerous time. Can you talk about that? Is that the truth? Are we facing greater threats inside our country than we are from outside?
Well, last night and early this morning, the Department of Homeland Security issued a bulletin officially proclaiming and stating that there is not necessarily a particularized specific threat to any particular individual or group or institution, but that the intelligence information indicates that we remain in a heightened state of alert and concern that there may be carry-on violent extremist activity, homegrown violent extremist activity in this country in the aftermath of the election and the inauguration. And all of the federal law enforcement organizations are vigilant, are going to remain vigilant. And that bulletin was issued by the Department of Homeland Security so that the public would know and would have the information so they could make informed decisions about their own safety.
But the warnings that went out before the inauguration were also that there were apparent plans, at least that was what was teased out there by the political extreme right, to attack state capitals as well. So it's not just the national symbols, is it?
No, not at all. It is in each of the 50 states, in all of our communities. I believe that President Biden has announced, and Maine Justice and the Department of Homeland Security has announced that this is going to require a whole of government, which includes federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, to remain vigilant. And that's simply because the inauguration has occurred and we are getting a week past that. In the days ahead, we have to remain vigilant because there is chatter, there is information that these domestic violent extremists continue to be motivated and perhaps on the verge of actually planning and coordinating some sort of violent activity.
So the nation's presidential election last November was the starting point for this to become a very public divide and debate over whether or not the election was legitimate. And I would love for you, though Florida was carried for President Trump's reelection, I know you were involved with local, state, and federal authorities in trying to make sure we had a secure election here and your peers around the country. Can you speak, non-politically about the election and what kind of unprecedented level, if it was, of cooperation there was among officials to have a secure election?
What I can really speak to is the state of Florida. The state of Florida came into very, very sharp focus. All of relatively well-informed citizens know that Florida's had a difficult and troubled history with regard to elections going smoothly and in public confidence in elections in Florida due to issues that have occurred over the past 20 years. But this came into very sharp focus for me for just a month or two after I came into office in January of 2019. The Mueller report came out and identified Florida and certain counties in Florida that had been targeted by foreign adversaries for election interference, hacking, and things of that sort. And there are also concerns about active measures such as misinformation, disinformation campaigns, particularly by foreign actors. So that focused the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security to work very, very closely with Florida Secretary of State, Laurel Lee, with the 67 supervisors of elections. And then over time, as COVID kicked in and the importance of the U.S. Postal Service and the role that the Postal Service would play in vote by mail in that process, there were lots of moving parts and there were groups of people at all levels, federal, state, and local, that we were ahead of the game, I'd like to say, in Florida, because we had a heads up that we were going to be a target going back to the spring of 2019. So by the time the election came around, there was very tight coordination, preparation, not only for the potential cyber hacking, but the misinformation and disinformation. And then with regard to allegations or contentions of fraud in the voter registration and the actual voting process, we were prepared to make certain that the systems are secure. So I am very, very proud that I had the opportunity to work with all these levels of government, particularly the Homeland Security, FBI, and the Florida Secretary of State. And I'm pleased and glad that in Florida, something about which I can speak, it was a solid, safe, secure election. And this has nothing to do with the outcome, but simply the process itself. And the most important thing to me is the public going forward will hopefully have renewed trust in the election process in Florida.
And kind of interesting that the state, we all remember in the year 2000, was holding up the entire outcome of the election. The results in Florida were well known and accurately tallied pretty much by the end of election night.
Well, I've heard an expression somewhere that comes to mind that if a relatively small group of people work in a very hard, diligent, disciplined manner to prevent a problem from occurring, that then when the problem doesn't occur, that a lot of people think there never really was a problem to begin with. So there were issues, there were problems, but there were a group of people that worked very hard over more than a year to get ahead of them. And I think that became manifest in the lack of controversy about the process of the election, not speaking to the outcomes, but the process of the elections in Florida.
Well, to pivot over to another priority topic and an area you have focused on during your service as U.S. Attorney, it's really bolstering, establishing a so-called public trust unit to prevent, pursue, prosecute, and punish public corruption among elected, appointed officials and those who try to influence them illegally. Can you speak to why that's a priority focus for federal law enforcement, and how big a deal is it?
Well, I have to give credit and attribute where that became planted in my mind before I actually came into office, between nomination and confirmation, in terms of learning everything I can about the mission in the office and its role in North Florida. And I came upon some news and media reports about former Senator Bob Graham. And he and three other colleagues of his formed kind of after they were out of office, a bipartisan group. And their number one focus was the rampancy of public corruption and the impact that that had on the public's loss of trust, particularly at the state level of government as well as locally. And I communicated and spoke with Governor Senator Graham and his other colleagues on that commission. And they had studied the issue. They knew that there was an acute need. They attempted to establish a public corruption unit here in North Florida. We're not able to do so. So I made it my mission to do so. And we're hard at work, approximately 2 years into that process. And I would have to give a lot of the credit for the whole idea to Governor Senator Graham more so than myself.
But you, I don't know how specific you can be, but you've actually bolstered the task force, a portion for this kind of work. And what kind of people are doing that kind of work in that courthouse down the street?
Well, most people are familiar with, at all levels of government, state, local, and federal, violent crime, drug trafficking, gangs, child sexual exploitation, human trafficking, these sorts of things that are a constant, high priority battle in our society. But a lot of times what goes neglected is the things that don't involve necessarily guns and drugs and violent crime. And that has to do with the public corruption and financial fraud and financial crimes and cyber related activity. And the state and local folks have plenty of tools as well to work on drugs and violent crime and things of that sort. But the space that's primarily reserved for federal law enforcement is public corruption, cyber crime, financial fraud. So that's an area that I've really tried to build in the Northern District of Florida with personnel, equipment, people, relationships. They're typically longer investigations. They're typically very document intensive and require a lot of analytics with regard to identifying relationships, flow of money, communications between people, and they take longer. They don't occur as rapidly as a typical violent crime or drug trafficking case.
So we're all familiar that because of the COVID, the prolonged shutdown of life, as we used to call it, normal since last March, has had a huge impact on the progress of justice. Trials have been delayed and such, but you very quietly were able to impanel a federal grand jury and actually have proceedings at the federal courthouse. How has that happened? And I think you have a couple of superlatives of doing something first, actually having a federal trial.
Yes, that's true. Well, as all organizations in our country, and since the COVID era began, have all been trying to cope with striking a balance between safety and following the science and undertaking all of those measures that need to be undertaken to make certain that people are kept safe and that we, as rapidly as possible, bring the virus under control. But some organizations have essential functions, and one of those is our criminal justice system and law enforcement. So the real art was blended with the science in terms of striking a balance at any given point in time with what the virus was doing, to continue to function and operate with grand juries, to continue to operate with trials. And sometimes we would have to stop and then resume and then stop and then resume. There was never a finish line to cross. But the Northern District of Florida, that was the first criminal case, state or federal, in the state of Florida that we tried in the Northern District back in late spring, early summer. So it's still a constant battle. It's still an issue. And intermittently, the courthouse is effectively shut down. And then we work very closely with the judges, Chief Judge Mark Walker, to strike that balance of not letting the justice system come to a complete stop, but being mindful of safety and applying science to make certain that people are as safe as possible.
Well, after I pound a few more hard questions to you, I know we're going to open it up to member questions that are starting to queue up, but I know people in the Tallahassee area are familiar with the corruption probes involving local folks. Let's just be general like that. Everybody seems to keep waiting for another big boot to drop. And I know you probably can't speak to that, but other cases you all have made in the 23 county region that is your district include, to the west of us, a lot of corruption cases in the Bay County area. And in Pensacola, I recall a case where somebody was illegally trying to sell a major piece of equipment to the Mideast country. So why is that a crime?
Well, you've raised two issues, at least as I see your question. One was the case having to do with violation of federal statutes that have to do with exporting certain types of technology to certain terrorist countries. And in the case that you were talking about, that would be Iran. And so that's a national security case. Once again, an area that state and local law enforcement doesn't necessarily work on directly. They're great partners with ours, but that's a uniquely federal area. And yes, we did have that case. Before I get into the public corruption side of your question, North Florida, as most people know, has lots of high-tech military research and development and other activities. We have these universities that are major research centers, University of Florida in Gainesville, FSU in Tallahassee, FAMU, University of West Florida, where a lot of, not necessarily research with military applications, although a lot of the research done there with military applications is heavily the target of foreign espionage. So here in the north, that was some call the forgotten area of North Florida between Gainesville and Pensacola, is replete with military research, with universities performing research. And there is a very active foreign espionage program here that is uniquely federal in what we work on. Now, going to the public trust, public corruption issue, a lot of places refer to that organization or division within a U.S. Attorney's Office as the public corruption unit. I like to refer to ours as the public trust unit, because the reason that we want to target and place resources on identifying, ferreting out, prosecuting, and punishing public corruption, because the real effect of it is the public's loss of trust in their government institutions, in the people that they elect, in the people that are actually running government as appointed government officials. And it all ties together with things that we were talking about earlier, whether it's riots, protests, civil disorder, fundamental divisions with this country, distrust of government institutions, distrust of politicians and elected officials. And so the public corruption unit is designed to make certain that the people in those positions of public trust know that we're out there, that we're investigating, that we're looking, and that we are going to do everything we can to deter that type of behavior.
You set it up. So after my next question, we'll go to the post-George Floyd period of time and what that has done to the civil rights issues that have been kicked up in all institutions, in particular law enforcement. But if you could reference, and again, this is not some general ethnic slur, but I've heard you speak and seen you write about China in particular, reference the espionage and the 1,000 Talents program. If you could share that with our members, what is that all about? Do we have spies among us at universities, in our communities? What What is that about?
That's certainly something I would love to have a whole separate segment to talk about, because there is a lot of detail to that. But most people think of spying and espionage as being military based, having to do with military equipment and technology, plans and intentions with regard to geopolitical territory and that sort of thing. And in the modern world, information and technology and research that largely has an economic component or an economic value. For example, research on health issues, research on agricultural issues, research on things other than guns, bombs, and bullets is also extremely valuable. And so China's Communist Party has a 1,000 Talents program where not all, but some. Once again, I want to make very, very clear, the vast majority of international students, whether they're from China and other places, are wonderful people here for pure, righteous academic pursuits. But the Chinese Communist Party has a program which was referred to as the 1,000 Talents programs, where certain individuals who come over to the United States and attend our universities and research centers collect information that has highly valuable economic aspects as opposed to military aspects. And that is among the things here that I pointed out earlier is a great risk. It's not only our military bases and research and development here with military applications, but our universities and the research going on there. And the Chinese Communist Party targets that. And they've been doing so for years. And resources are allocated through the FBI and our office and other governmental agencies to identify that and ferret that out. And that will continue to be an issue.
But for the comfort of our members and our local citizens, the universities are aware of this, and they are working quietly, collaboratively on these kinds of issues too.
They are, and that is largely, the way I look at law enforcement is there is the information preventative, prevent it before it happens, get ahead of it, educate, inform, and then there's the indictment, prosecute, punish, and prison, and that whole side of law enforcement. And I, as you can probably tell, I'm very focused on the preemptive, proactive, preventative information as opposed to indictments. And yes, the FBI has a very strong program where they have representatives that go into the universities, particularly the research departments that are the targets of this economic espionage, educate them, explain to them the tradecraft of how this works. And so, yes, there is a very strong dialogue, a very strong focus. It's not just about investigating it, monitoring it, arresting, charging, prosecuting, and imprisoning. It's very heavy on the proactive, preventative side in this economic espionage.
Well, our members, I think you are aware, are run the gamut on the political spectrum, Democrat, Republicans, independents, but we all get along pretty well. We're in the room together or even a virtual room. But since the George Floyd killing, you have been involved in active outreach to the Black community because the issues about systemic racism in various institutions are typified in these conversations about how law enforcement relates to the Black community. Can you be a little specific about that, the perception and the reality that if you're a Black American, you get treated differently too often by law enforcement, though we know most police officers are honest, hardworking people trying to do a hard job the right way. But as in any group, there are some outliers that maybe go too far. Can you address those issues?
Sure. My interest in heavy involvement in the relationship between law enforcement, and particularly the Black community, preceded George Floyd. It happened shortly after I came into office, where key leaders in the Black community came to sit down and figure out what this new Trump appointee U.S. attorney was all about. And they were very candid with me. I will mention them. I'm very proud of my relationship and friendship with them. That would be Jackie Perkins and Colonel Ron Joe came to meet with me, and they wanted to know what my intentions were and my plans were in dealing with the issue that you speak of, the challenges and the issues that lie between law enforcement and the Black community. So for a substantial period of time, I became informed about that issue, learned about that issue. And as you pointed out at the beginning of this, my history or my background for 30-something years has been as a civil litigator in a private law firm. I don't have built-in points of view as a career law enforcement person would, had I been a law enforcement officer or a federal prosecutor. So I kind of came in with an open mind about those issues. But then while I was immersing myself in the world of federal, state, and local law enforcement, actually going out with law enforcement officials to execute search warrants and arrests, and I got to understand the culture and the mindset on that side, while at the same time, Jackie Perkins and Colonel Ron Joe were introducing me to leaders in the Black community, particularly the young leaders in the Black community, to understand where they were coming from in terms of their perceptions about things. So it's been of keen interest to me, and whatever happens with me with regard to whether I remain the U.S. attorney or not, I've committed, particularly to the young people in the Black community, these leaders, that I'm going to continue to work on them to have a discussion that's far more fundamental than things such as chokeholds, no-knock warrants, and the particular kind of symptoms, if you will, of a broader issue in terms of what are the fundamental expectation, not just of the community at large, but of individual neighborhoods. What is it they seek or want from law enforcement as opposed to what government might assume that they want from law enforcement?
Well, the Department of Justice and your office have notified law enforcement at state and local levels that to receive federal grants, and there are all sorts of federal funding programs, what is it that police agencies have to do to have a set of policies and procedures that meet the standard the feds would consider minimally important to receive these kinds of law enforcement grants?
Yes, what you're referring to is generally called in the community policing standards. And that basically is, what are the rules of the road once the encounter has occurred, once there is law enforcement interacting directly, physically in the same space with a citizen in the community? What are the rules in terms of when use of force is permitted? What is the types of use of force, using principles such as de-escalation, whether and under what circumstances to have no-knock warrants? There's a whole list of those things, and that's a wonderful and good process. But the whole analysis begins with, there's this encounter, and I'm trying to expand the discussion and analysis of why did that encounter happen? Why was law enforcement in that community? Was there some kind of surge in law enforcement? What were the rules in terms of the stops and the engagements? There are far more fundamental questions about what it is that members of the Black community and Black neighborhoods have a completely different perception, based on my point of view, than oftentimes law enforcement officers in terms of the orders that they're given about where to be and what to do, and how to, particularly after a surge in, for example, shootings, to have a surge of law enforcement, which creates more encounters, which creates the need for all these micro decisions to happen in microseconds about force escalation and so forth. I'm interested in the much broader question, and that's the discussion I want to be part of, whether or not I'm the U.S. attorney.
Well, two more tight questions, and then we'll open it up to the member questions that have queued up. You teed this up, and it's in your bio. You were appointed by the President Trump administration, been in the job about 2 years. So a two-part question before the second question. How much does politics enter into how you've approached that job these almost 2 past years? You're a political appointee, but is politics or political pressures put on your office to do one thing or another?
No, I can say for my 2 years in office, there has not been any kind of political pressure exerted on me. Now, it's my point of view that a reasonable thing to happen is the people of this country elect a president, and that president appoints an attorney general. And they can come up with certain priorities of certain areas that they want to focus on. Some want to focus on, for example, immigration enforcement. Some want to focus on violent crime. Some want to focus on public corruption. Some want to focus on civil rights. So, and then they establish their priorities. They say, whatever administration it is, these are our priorities. But the U.S. attorneys, the 93 U.S. attorneys, have a wide lane within which to operate in terms of carrying out those priorities and utilizing the resources, the people, the equipment, the tools to pursue that area. But I've never been pressured by anyone as to push one area versus another area. Each U.S. attorney has wide discretion. Generally, it's very early in the Biden administration and pending the confirmation of Judge Garland to see where they have priorities and but these are appropriate things. These are what people elected a certain administration to focus on and do. And for example, I know that racial equity and equal racial justice and civil rights are going to be very important in the Biden administration, and rightfully so. I don't look at that as political pressure or any kind of partisan pressure. Those are elected officials accountable to the people, setting policy priorities where they want resources allocated, and it's the job of the U.S. attorneys to carry that out.
You know, many of our members and lots of folks in this region live and breathe politics. It's kind of what makes life go round in the capital city. And we know when a new governor comes in or a new president, there's often get them all out, agency heads, senior staff at the federal and the state level. So you're appointed by President Trump. It is a brand new administration, less than a couple of weeks into the job. Do you want to stay as U.S. attorney?
I do. I would like to stay because I don't believe that the work that we do in the U.S. Attorney's Office is partisan or political. Of my 2 years in the Trump administration, working under Attorney General Barr, there was not any kind of pressure or duress or influence on the work that we did. there was emphasis on certain areas, just as there will be emphasis on certain areas in the Biden administration and upon confirmation, Judge Garland. And I feel comfortable that I can do that honorably and respectably. My wife is comfortable doing her job and what she does. Our 4 sons are out of the house. I've had 30 plus years in the private sector. And I really am enjoying, not just in a selfish way, enjoying this public service, but it seems to me suited to my skills, talents, and abilities. So yes, I'd like to remain in the job, but I fully understand that I serve at the pleasure of whoever is the president. And I would root for and cheer for and applaud whoever would succeed me if I'm not the U.S. attorney.
But you do want to stay in the job if possible.
I would.
And with offices in Pensacola, Panama City, Tallahassee, and Gainesville, you have a condo here in Tallahassee, though your home is in Shalimar in the Panhandle. And I think you have an apartment in Panama City. So you're kind of doing this job at some expense to yourself, not just the time away from your family, but you travel the district quite a bit.
Well, that's true. I've come to know the other U.S. attorneys over the course of the last 2 years, and I am an outlier in terms of the profile. Typical U.S. attorney is a bit younger, has kids at home, mortgage, a lot of things going on. And a U.S. attorney is inherently a transient political figure. It is not a career. So I definitely have brought a lot of energy, resources, and focus. My family looks at it as kind of a journey. And, my sons, as you pointed out, are in public service. My wife is a very community-oriented pediatrician. And so it's kind of a family endeavor or journey. We got the apartment in Pensacola right across from the office, and the apartment in Tallahassee right across from the courthouse. So yes, that's what I do.
Well, I don't want to pry too deep into your personal life, but I do think as we're in this prolonged COVID era of our lives that we had hoped would be only a few weeks or a few months, it's now lipped into 2021. I think most people think 2020, oh my God, one of the worst years ever, maybe the worst year ever. COVID has touched your entire family. And if you're able or willing to share some details about that, not only getting it, but getting through it, and then on the other side of it, the whole blood donation thing, I think it's a very interesting story, sir.
Well, again, my family, we have a bit of we try to have a sense of humor about things. So if I seem lighthearted about this, I'm really not, but it's just kind of maybe a coping mechanism. But in any event, in June, well into COVID, our youngest son became very ill in Charleston, and the family needed to gather to be around him for he has brain cancer and have a very significant surgery. So the whole family gathered together, daughters-in-law, everybody. We rented a house near the medical center, and we were very observant in trying to comply with COVID, protocols and requirements. My wife's very strict about that as a physician. But in the day or two before this surgery, which was a very high-risk procedure, all of my son's cadet friends from the Citadel wanted to come over and give him love. And it became, unfortunately, kind of a free-for-all. So the bottom line to that is, my son recovered from the surgery and his recuperation. We all came down a couple of days later with COVID, every one of us, and went through the whole process. All of us fortunately got through it pretty well, but it was kind of a double whammy 2020 special with the brain cancer, brain tumor diagnosis, the surgery, and we all got COVID at the same time. But afterwards, the FBI special agent in charge, Rachel Rojas, and I, and some other state and local law enforcement officials who had recovered from COVID did donate convalescent plasma as part of that whole odyssey with COVID this past summer.
But when you personally discovered you had it, it was because of the symptoms. It's somewhat amusing, the whole fish lunch story, if you would share that.
Well, certainly, I don't know. I mean, I had heard, and I guess I understood in the abstract, that one of the symptoms of COVID was you lost your taste, which I could not even fathom what that would be like. It just seemed absurd to me, the notion, what do you mean you can't taste something? I'd never had that experience. And then I was having some delicious fish and I couldn't taste it. And I said to myself, well, I'm just psyching myself out. I'm thinking I have COVID. I really can't taste it. And this is some kind of psychological thing. So then I took out the Tabasco hot sauce and I started putting it on the fish, and I still didn't taste it, and I still didn't taste it. And then I started sweating, but I didn't taste it. And I knew that I had an issue and got tested, and I was positive.
Well, we're glad that you and your family all traversed it. Can you speak to, it's usually faceless, who knows who's a DEA agent locally or an FBI agent or ATF or US Marshals. you put a higher profile face on the work of the U.S. Attorney's Office than anyone in my 31 years of living here. And so please explain first why so transparent. And number two, the relationship of all these, faceless federal law enforcement folks amidst us doing their jobs and how you work with them.
Coming into government after 30 plus years in the private sector, I had my own set of sort of views and wonderful perceptions I had of government and of law enforcement. And then I had my gripes as a citizen. And one of the things that's always frustrated me as a citizen is where there's an organization that is so opaque and secret, and it's taxpayer funded, and it has an essential mission. And that balance, as in all things, has to be struck between, for example, with the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. Obviously, they have to be somewhat opaque and not transparent in order to do what they do effectively. But my belief was that the U.S. Attorney's Office in particular needed to be more transparent. If we wanted the public to trust that we were effectively performing our mission, that we were relevant with state and local law enforcement and doing things that people expected that only we can do, whether it's the economic espionage, particularly the public corruption, financial fraud, I wanted the public to know as much as they could about what we were doing. So in order to get the public's trust, you need to be transparent, you need to be accountable. And I made it my effort to make certain that I never crossed a line with disclosing classified information or disclosing grand jury investigative information. But there's a wide swath of information and activities and things that we do that I thought the pendulum had swung too far in terms of no accountability, no transparency. We only answer to Washington. So I've done everything I can to be very accessible, to be very open, to come and participate in programs like this. And quite frankly, to say a lot of things that have not historically been said in the Northern District of Florida by U.S. attorneys. And so that is just one of the principles and precepts I brought into the job. And I'm interested, if I remain in the job, in exercising my discretion to talk more about what we're doing, and in some instances talking about investigations where it is important. And there's actually a DOJ rule that says ordinarily we don't confirm or deny investigations, but where it is important to assure the public that we are doing our mission, that we are taking appropriate measures, or in instances where the public safety, if there's a risk or a threat of something, then there is some prerogative of U.S. attorneys to break away from the we don't confirm or deny. And so after 2 years of getting my feet on the ground and trying to understand where there has to be silence and secrecy and where there can be transparency, I think I'm getting a sense of that. Of course, I'm eager to get direction from Attorney General, if confirmed, Garland, now Judge Garland, as to what the rules of the road will be for the individual U.S. attorneys on transparency and accepting accountability for solving problems, just like any other government official. You
used a phrase a minute ago that frustrates both journalists and average citizens about that the feds and other law enforcement, but particularly the feds, we've heard that phrase, can neither confirm nor deny the existence of an investigation or the non-existence of an investigation. We referenced the corruption issues and folks wondering if the one involving local people is winding to a close. Is there some next chapter? And while you have had some processes take place at the courthouse, grand jury and trials, other trials have been delayed. Can you speak in general with any specifics about local cases that are still hanging?
I'm not at this time. As you appreciate, it's a very dynamic time. The new administration and of President Biden and the new administration stepping into the Department of Justice as to what they want to do with if, although I'm not going to confirm or deny here, a matter is under investigation, those types of things are being reviewed by new leadership at the Justice Department. So I'm not going to certainly today, with all due respect to everyone, not engage and discuss to confirm or deny any of those things. But I can say that on a going forward basis, subject to my direction and control from Maine Justice and the Attorney General, I'm going to do everything I can to be as transparent as I can.
Well, something of concern when we are still seeing details emerge from January 6th, going back to the attack on the nation's capital, violent folks intent on disrupting democracy, disrupting a process of validating the election. We're learning now that more than 100 Capitol Police officers were injured, not just the few we've known about for most of these 3 weeks, but also we're learning that some of the folks who invaded the Capitol are in or were in the military, are in or were in law enforcement. What kind of concern does that create, that there may be this sleeping giant of insurrection within established military and law enforcement circles?
It's a significant concern. I've got a bit of a unique perspective on this, and that a good friend and colleague of mine, Mike Sherwin, is the acting United States Attorney in the District of Columbia in Washington that is lead on the investigation and prosecution of all things related to the January 6th siege and attack on the Capitol. And of course, there is the first level of folks that were physically present that did breach the Capitol and get in the Capitol. And those are among, I think it's approaching, if not exceeding 150 that are being, as occurred here in the Northern District and other districts around the country, arrested and charged. And then to the extent that there are tentacles that reach beyond those individuals, that's all part of the investigations that's going on, led by Mike Sherwin in Washington, that the other U.S. attorneys and FBI field offices around the country are engaging in and assisting on. So there is very, very heightened concern on this issue that you've pointed out, and the resources are being allocated, and then there's the will and there's the intention there to follow the facts wherever they lead.
Well, in our 3 branches of government, I think most folks would presume that it's the legislative and executive branches that are far more political than judicial branch. And there's such a mystery, a mystique to the judicial branch, because so much of what it does is in secrecy, and very few people actually attend a federal courtroom event, a hearing or a trial. I had the privilege of being at one, which was actually a plea, and I was stunned at how respectful the judge was to the defendant standing in front of him, pleading guilty to some serious corrupt things. I'm not going to be specific about names, but I had never been in that situation before. But it was kind of it was really made me proud as an American to see that here it is, people on their worst day are being treated with respect by a federal judge as they cop to serious charges. Is that standard?
Well, I can tell you in the federal court system in particular, decorum, respect, formality is still very sacred and very sacrosanct. And if you were here in Tallahassee, you were in front of Judge Hinkle, Judge Walker, or Judge Windsor, and the amazing vetting process and all of the entire process of becoming a federal judge, a life tenured federal judge. It truly is the best of the best of the best. And they run their courtrooms with great discipline, but with great humanity and humility. They will stand for no nonsense, but by the same token, any defendant in that courtroom, no matter what the charges, no matter the background, no matter anything, is always treated with the highest respect, and their constitutional rights are protected, particularly with the judges here in the Northern District, based on my personal experience with them.
Notwithstanding the inspiring inscription from Emma Lazarus on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, immigration issues continue to be one of the big wedge political divide issues. But you have participated during your U.S. Attorney stint in naturalization ceremonies. And can you speak to what that's like to see folks who are not native born Americans become citizens, how that has touched you, or what that's like to witness that?
The first official act I did as a U.S. attorney in January 2019 was to, along with the federal judge, handle one of these immigration naturalization ceremonies. And basically what that is, the federal judge, it occurs in a courtroom with all of its majesty and grandeur, and that I, on behalf of the United States government, make a motion or request for the judge in a very formal way in open court with all of the soon-to-be naturalized citizens and their families out in the well of the courtroom. This is before COVID. We haven't had one of these since COVID. And then I explain to the judge that they've met all the requirements of citizenship, and I make the motion that the judge acknowledge them and swear them as citizens. And it is one of the most beautiful, moving things, including the weddings of my sons and my own, in terms of me physically and emotionally being moved by that event. And a lot of times U.S. attorneys will delegate that to assistant U.S. attorneys to do those ceremonies. Judge Stan Pellos and I, now retired Judge Stan Pellos, loved doing those ceremonies. I always wanted to do that ceremony. And he and I developed a Judge Dan Pellos, U.S. Attorney Keefe approach to it to make it as special as we could for the families.
But a lot of those folks taking the oath to become Americans, it's a very emotional thing for them and their families. I've seen people tear up in ones I've attended in Miami when I lived down there. It's a very emotional, beautiful ceremony.
The process that those individuals go through to comply with all the legal requirements in terms of the time, the process, all of the frictions associated with it, they truly, badly, earnestly want to become U.S. citizens. And when they finally go through all that, it is just, if you've never been to one, I strongly encourage that you go to one. You feel bad because you were born here and you've always been a citizen. That's something that's just missing from you. The idea of not being a U.S. citizen and then going through all the challenges of becoming one, I strongly believe that they are oftentimes more heartfelt and more significant than just being happen to be born in America.
Well, I don't believe you personally are active on Facebook, maybe a bit on Twitter, but those platforms that didn't exist a couple decades ago are now investigative tools for you and folks in law enforcement. It's how you're pursuing some of these folks that participated in the January 6th insurrection, or the local man who expressed such extreme intent, violent motives that that's the evidence against him. And this is evidence.
Well, it is. It's a key investigative tool, but there's a bigger aspect of whether it's protests in streets and the line between a protest and a riot, whether it's First Amendment protected expression on Twitter, on Facebook, or other social media, or coordination and planning of an imminent attack. Right now, a great challenge in our country is where is that line between a group of individuals coordinating and planning an imminent attack and making threats of violence online that have impact on lives, institutions, and people, and the free expression of ideas that was so important. It was the First Amendment. And so in the case recently here in Tallahassee, an order came out. It's in the newspaper if you want to look at it. But in the case of the individual we charged here in Tallahassee, the struggle was things that were said, particularly in social media platforms by this individual. When is it and where is it the line is crossed to imminent attack or imminent violence versus just expressing worldviews and ideas and concepts? And Judge Frank, in several orders, really sets forth what the legal principles are that apply on where that line is. And it is my belief that on all sorts of fronts in this country is going to be key as we hopefully overcome the divide and division in this country, that the way that is done through the expression of ideas, through the orderly democratic process, and not through violence. But yes, a key indicator, not only tips and leads that you get in the old fashioned way, but analysts looking at this open source social media to see who is crossing that line. And then there's more focused investigative efforts that are a little more invasive.
But that was what was scary to me in the allegations and the charges against the local man from the left side of extremism, who intended, from what he wrote, I think, to attack right-wing protesters who were expected at Florida's Capitol and law enforcement. Is that correct?
Well, very generally, and of course, all of the particulars of this are set forth in documents filed in the court, and that individual deserves a fair trial. So I don't want to expand upon the particular details of that case, but it is, as you point out, basically a cycle, whether it's from the left, whether it's from the right, wherever it is on the political spectrum. What matters is conduct, and the idea to separate political views, free expression of them, the right to protest, the right to assemble, the right to seek redress from your government. It is the First Amendment for a reason, but to make certain that the public's protected, that there's not just after a violent, mass violent act to just punish and prosecute, but to be able to spot it, see it through social media, through people who see something and say something, where law enforcement in a constitutionally compliant way can detect, deter, and disrupt that before it manifests itself in a violent act or an event like occurred in our Capitol on January 6th.
Well, I appreciate your really terrific answers to questions I've teed up, including some I anticipated our members would ask. But Jay Rebel has, I think, a couple from members as well.
Yes, Ron, thanks. And Mr. U.S. Attorney, appreciate the candid answers. I know our members appreciate that as well. Good segue off that last comment from member Andy Harrison. He asked, can you give some insight into the constitutionality of social media sites censoring content that's posted on their platforms? And also maybe as a follow-up to that, what is the responsibility of the provider and what is the responsibility of the posting party?
That question, as much as I mentioned my desire to be transparent and to engage and be accessible, there are certain areas that have to do with policy that really don't, on its face, have to do with law enforcement. Law enforcement certainly looks at social media and things published on social media to show indications or trends toward criminal activity. But on the fundamental policy questions about the tech organizations that provide the platforms and curate the platforms, that is a policy issue for our state legislatures, for our United States Congress and elected officials, President Biden and others. And I'm sure it'll be sorted out by the federal judges and the judiciary. But right now, in terms of my role, I don't want to be anything more than I am. I'm a law enforcement officer, a chief federal law enforcement officer in the Northern District of Florida. And my opinions really don't matter on that, nor should I share them or engage in the public policy debate on those media platforms and the controversy about censorship and so forth.
Very good. Another question from member John Trombetta. And ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and put those in the Q&A section or in the chat. We'll get to them. But John asked regarding the insurrection, it's brought to light that there's the possibility of extremists employed within law enforcement, military, and other areas of public service. What's the level of concern in the law enforcement community about that today?
Well, it is significant, and there is a level of concern, and there's excellent information sharing, much more than people know, and I want to get the word out, and I want to be as transparent about that as possible. There's excellent information sharing between all the federal government organizations, whether it's the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the intelligence community, with state and local government. In Florida, that means the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the federal law enforcement agencies work so closely together. They share information, and then they in turn share information with the sheriffs and the police chiefs. And then of course, the National Guard through its role with the state. This information about the risk and concern that you've pointed out is known to those folks. And it is an area of scrutiny and concern, and they're looking at it. It's certainly not being overlooked, and it is significant.
Another question, this from our fearless leader, Christina Johnson. She asked, with so many U.S. attorneys around the country, obviously here in our state, you've got probably the largest share of counties. What's the coordination like between U.S. attorneys within a state like ours that's so large that has so many people in it?
It's good. The other two U.S. attorneys and I have a regularly scheduled Friday morning telephone call, and we've had it for the entire time I've been in office, where we talk about what's going on, things that might be of common concern. So the communication is good, the coordination is good. But for example, the U.S. attorney that has the Southern District of Florida, who's based in Miami, and the U.S. attorney who has the Middle District of Florida, she is based in Tallahassee. Those districts can be very, very different than the Northern District of Florida. There's more similarities perhaps between the Southern District of Alabama, the Southern District of Georgia, or South Carolina in terms of the issues they face based on the number of assistant U.S. attorneys and the geographic nature and the demographics that we have more similar problems, even though there's a state line separating us. So what is it they say with Florida? It's like having 9 or 10 different states in one state in terms of everything from topography, demographics, culture, language, which makes Florida a wonderful, diverse place. But to answer your question, yes, the other two U.S. attorneys and I communicate each week, if not more often.
Mr. Keefe, before we throw it back to our president, Christina Johnson, I wanted to ask you this. There are moments in our modern history that we've experienced that kind of plunged the entire population of the country seemingly into a sense of unity that is rare. The moon walk, all right, in 1969, for those of us who were alive then. 9/11, if you want to go to some horrible thing that kind of united all Americans in a sense of horror and solidarity about purpose. And it's too often a sporting event or the bicentennial for the US. But we're in this period of divide that is unlike anything I can remember, including my college years when it was the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, women's movement, beginning of the environmental movement. You're a federal official. Inspire us about what is your hope that this country can come together, not stop disagreeing about issues, but to have a greater sense of unity than we seem to be feeling right now about the things that really matter.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and the private citizen part of me definitely has views, and I would love to use my time on this platform to share those. But what I really want to say, in keeping with the lane that I operate in, I'm here today not as a private citizen. I'm here as the United States Attorney. But what we see and what we encounter in federal law enforcement, whether it's public corruption, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's violent crime, drug networks, all of these things are reflective of what's going on in our society. Civil rights issues, excessive force with state and local police and the Black community, all of these shifting plates of all these different political issues manifest themselves out there in law enforcement. We are really the tip of the spear where all these conflicting forces come together, this division, this doubt, this dissension in our society, whether it's election security. So I am very hopeful that the country will unify, that we will come together, that we will find a way to solve out our divisions and resolve our divisions and differences without violence. But I can tell you, as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer in the Northern District of Florida, that we will do everything possible to maintain vigilance so that we detect, disrupt, and dismantle any of these violent domestic extremists that go beyond exchanging thoughts and ideas to imminent violence. And so that's my role. That's what I'm focused on. I'm hopeful. I'm a citizen like anyone else that has a worldview on how things ought to be. But in my lane right now, I want the public to trust that federal law enforcement is working very closely with state and local law enforcement to make certain that the line isn't crossed beyond the First Amendment, and that that's my job, and that we are here and that we are focused on that. I want to be as transparent as I can about what we're doing and how we're doing it without giving up anything that gives away what we're doing and compromises our mission. And I'm comfortable being held accountable in terms of our office performing well and doing its job to continue to earn the public's trust.
Well, first of all, thank you for your openness and your dedication and your service with your colleagues in the whole federal law enforcement corridor, particularly the U.S. Attorney's Office that you had. I know it's appropriate for us to end before Christina wraps it up as our president with a question from Florida's beloved Pulitzer Prize winner, Lucy Morgan. Jay, you want to share that?
Sure thing. Lucy asked, what do you think of Matt Gaetz? Wasn't he your former law partner? Would love to. I think she's looking for some reflection on the congressman.
Certainly. I actually came to know Matt Gaetz. My private law firm back in Fort Walton Beach represented the Okaloosa County School District on which Matt's father, former Senate President Don Gaetz, served as a board member and as a superintendent of schools. And I came to know Matt through that relationship. And when Matt got out of law school and came back to Fort Walton Beach, we hired him at our law firm, and he was an outstanding, excellent young lawyer, very talented, great skill. And then everybody else knows the part of history where he became a member of the Florida House of Representatives and a member of Congress. And that there was this new president in Washington when Matt arrived, and they became very close. And that was a key component in this obscure nobody from Shalimar, Florida, not actually Fort Walton Beach, finding his way to becoming the presidentially nominated, Senate confirmed by Senator Nelson, as well as Senator Rubio, but Senator Nelson as well. And that is a key part of my journey to be where I am today. I have very, very little actual communication with Matt since I've been in office. I'm very busy, and he has ascended to all sorts of different levels of activity in the media and so forth. So I have very little interaction with him, but was his employer at a law firm back in Fort Walton.
And clearly not responsible for his political views and positions.
No, I'm not. That is true. He certainly speaks his own mind on his views.
Well, President Christina Johnson, thank you for having Mr. Keefe join our club today, and we toss it back to you.
Thank you. And members, this is exactly why we are part of Capital Tiger Bay. When we bring in caliber of speakers like U.S. Attorney Larry Keefe, and to share his experience with us, it's just, you're not going to be able to find that anyplace else. And so to our board member, Special Agent Ron Sachs, thank you for bringing in the U.S. Attorney and Mr. Keefe, thank you. You mentioned earlier in the program that there's a small group of people working behind the scenes to keeping us safe, and we're glad you're at the helm. And I want to thank you for your service and for your family and their service to not only to Florida, but to the country. And again, thank you so much. It was a great program. Members, thank you for participating, and we'll let you know our next program. Thank you all for coming.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you.